There's a lot going on in the world today. One of the areas I want to focus on is communist China. Some very exciting things happening there and very brave people. You know, it's one thing to protest in America, where the media stand behind the protesters, especially if they're Marxists or they're anarchists and they're particularly violent and they're attacking cops or attacking Republicans. They'll have the full-throated support of the corrupt Democrat Party media. In China, of course, they'll kill you. They don't have a free media. And so you have individual citizens who are using their iPhones and other handheld devices to try and get pictures, video of what's taking place and get them to the West. You don't get much help from Apple, which has, and I'm no technology expert, but has agreed to the communist Chinese demands in terms of the ability of one citizen to communicate with the next, in terms of downloading information. Apple has prevented the Chinese citizens from doing that. And of course, it wasn't more than a week ago that Michael Bloomberg apologized to the communist Chinese regime because he said something that was viewed as a criticism, God forbid. Now, as these freedom protests are occurring, the National Basketball Association has said nothing. The corporatists who rely now on communist China to line their pockets, they've said nothing. The phony civil libertarians in America, from LeBron James to Al Sharpton to you name it, they have said nothing. They're not going to say anything. And of course, much of the media has kept its mouth shut. When you look at NBC sold out to the communist Chinese regime in order to cover the Olympics there. But some of this information is getting out, and some of it is being handled by the media. I mean, the first clip you'll see is NBC News. Why? Well, the Olympics are over, and they can't exactly ignore it totally. But more to the point, what's going on here in China is people are sick and tired of being treated like cattle. You have entire cities that have fences and barbed wire around them, and the police state ensuring that people don't leave their homes. People haven't left their homes for months, in some cases over a year. People are going hungry. They're not even allowed to go out to purchase food. Some of them don't have clean water. Some of them can't get to a doctor. Now, it's one thing to run a communist regime, a police state, but it's quite another when you deny the people all kinds of quality of life issues that they're used to having. North Korea, they're not used to having anything. In China, they are. And so people are starting to rise up. You had a fire at an apartment building, and a number of people died, including a baby. Why? Because the police had soldered or welded the door shut, so people couldn't get out. The New York Times and CNN, not that long ago, about a year ago, give or take, they congratulated communist China and said that the way they had handled the virus essentially eliminated it. They beat the pandemic, and that it was an example to all. What was the example? The power of the police state. When you look at the blue states in this country and the blue cities in this country and how they treated the citizenry, you got a little taste of it. They didn't care if businesses were shut down, if churches and synagogues were shut down. You couldn't buy weapons at a gun shop. You could get booze, of course, at state-owned alcohol stores. I guess ABC they call them. I don't drink, so I don't know. But you get the point. And you could see these totalitarian tactics being instituted by Murphy in New Jersey, by Pritzker in Illinois, by Whitmer in Michigan, by Newsom in California, by Cuomo in New York, and go right down the list. They're proud of themselves. Fauci, one of his closest confidants, went to China, it turns out, to see how the Chinese were handling this. And he came back and reported to Fauci, and they were very excited about what the communist Chinese were doing. And they pushed the same thing. Our children have been marred by this psychologically in terms of their educational progress as well. Many businesses don't exist as a result. We've gone nearly bankrupt spending money under the cover of COVID, even though much of it never went to COVID, and so forth and so on. And in the end, we had a report last week that most people who died from COVID were over 65 and had had vaccine shots. Well, isn't that interesting? We knew most people who were dying from COVID were older, my age and older. They weren't children. They weren't middle-aged. This is why the governor of Florida, DeSantis, was so successful. They looked at the data as quickly as it was available, and they realized they needed to deal with nursing homes and assisted living facilities first and foremost. So the Chinese have had what they call a zero policy that nobody is to get this virus. And until that's the case, everybody must be treated as somebody who's capable of carrying and passing the virus. So for a police state that has, you ready for this? Hundreds of millions of domestic security cameras. You heard me right. The estimate is 500 million monitoring their citizenry. They're having a problem right now. And that is their citizenry has had enough, or at least a significant number of the citizens. Now, as a footnote, this is very good for us because it certainly delays any invasion of Taiwan as far as I'm concerned. But it also shows that the propaganda and the marketing of Xi and the Communist Party in China indicates that it's not a society that will tolerate everything and anything. It's just not. It is, as I say, a police state. But it has its problems. So far, the Biden administration has responded passively. They haven't endorsed the protesters. They haven't endorsed free speech. Well, they have in a very milquetoast way. They haven't condemned Apple for shutting down the ability of citizen to communicate with citizen. In other words, they're just sort of sitting back and watching. They've done virtually the same thing in Iran, where the people in Iran have had enough, where women there are taken off the streets. They are horribly tortured and raped by this so-called religious regime, which isn't religious at all. It's a fundamentalist, totalitarian, fascist regime, where the people who get rich are the Ayatollah and his family and his surrogates and his lieutenants as they divide up the economy in different sectors of industry. It's really appalling. They're kleptocrats is what they are. So let's take a look at this, starting with just a few days ago, what's going on in China. NBC Nightly News, of all places. Go.
Tonight, rare scenes of open discontent. Video showing protesters in Xinjiang fed up with China's zero COVID rules, chanting, "End the lockdown." Authorities wearing hazmat suits attempting to hold their ground. The show of public defiance, part of a national outcry, stoked by a deadly apartment fire Friday night that killed 10 people, including children. Videos on social media appearing to show emergency crews slowed down by COVID measures around the high-rise. It took 3 hours to put out the flames. Residents, many locked down for months, were trapped. China's government had tried tweaking zero COVID rules, but with cases now at a record high, they're bearing down again. In Beijing, schools, stores, and offices are closed like it's the early days of 2020. Except now, growing signs of pushing back. In Guangzhou, crowds charged at barricades, while in Zhengzhou this week, clashes at the Foxconn factory making iPhones. Videos on social media showed crowds of police shoving workers protesting over pay and COVID rules. Foxconn apologized and gave payouts for workers to leave.
Now let's stop there a second. A lot of people come and work in these massive factories, which is why they're able to keep the prices down. But Apple's there for that reason. Apple's worth trillions of dollars, and yet it has to produce its products in China. I ask you why. Now it's wisely moving much of its production, or a lot of it, to India. But why not move it to the United States? Because it costs more? Because of the labor unions? Because of the material costs? Well, that's the nature of big government. That's what big government causes, quite frankly. But again, that aside, they drew a lot of workers in from rural areas and other cities to work at places like Apple with promises of certain types of pay and benefits. And then when they get there, they slash the promised pay, Their hours are much longer than they're told, and now they're locked into these factories because of COVID. And so they're working slave hours. And so the government lied to them. Apple and other companies in this country are participating in this, just so you know. So people are reaching their boiling point. Go ahead.
Apple to warn that iPhone output will take a hit. Online criticism of the government's policy is escalating too. At times, overwhelming censors here. In Xinjiang, officials say they're now reopening areas that are low risk. Protesters lamenting it comes far too late.
Yeah, so they're sending in the cops, they're sending in the secret police. They're starting to drag people away, I'm sure, who will never be seen again. And this is your Marxist paradise.
Want to see more? Sign up for Levin TV.